Happy History Day, fellow NHD competitors. This is Mr. Stewart coming at you with a new model to write a high-quality thesis statement for your National History Day project. I would argue that this thesis model, which I have dubbed the 3 C's method, can be an effective model to write a thesis statement for any kind of research-based work you may complete for school, but is especially effective for the National History Day project, which has emphasized so strongly the so what question in history, not just the who, what, where, when, and why. The image you can see in front of you is the basic layout for a high-quality History Day exhibit. This model is written in this way because usually any high-quality History Day project can make a high-quality History Day exhibit. That is, after all, where the competition started. But the thesis statement is at the core of your History Day project just as much as the heart of your story or main event is. Not only does the thesis statement tell us why our main event is so important, but it also helps us constrain the type of information that we include in our project so that we don't exhaust our audience with too much information or just overemphasize pieces of the storyline that aren't necessarily helpful in proving our main point. Again, at the core of your History Day project is your argument. Why is this main point such a key turning point in history, and how does it connect to that theme? Not, this is a thing that happened in history, and there's some things that happened around it that are also important. You have to focus on the consequence of your thesis statement. But before we get to consequences, we need to focus on our first C, which is context. Context should make up about 25% of your thesis statement, and it should always be the first thing that your viewers read. Why? Because context is the historical setting. It's the events that lead into the key moments that help us better understand how is it that the stage was set for this main event to happen, and what were some of the most important trends going on in society that will help us to better understand what eventually goes on to change in history. Without context, we don't understand why the world was the way it was before your main event, and we can't know that those things are changing as soon as you introduce your consequences. So in the context section, again, you should have your historical setting, key figures or groups, and also main issues that are going to be a key focus of your story later. Again, it should be about 25% of your thesis statement, and I've got an example for you to help you visualize what a high-quality thesis statement would look like. So this statement is from one of my students who competed in the national competition, and the context portion of this thesis statement is increased immigration and industrial advancements in the early 1900s nurtured the United States Industrial Revolution and exacerbated working conditions. So we know what we're going to be talking about in this project without even knowing what the main event is. We know immigration is going to be involved. We know there's going to be industrial growth involved. We also know that we're talking about the early 1900s, which can paint a picture for many readers as to what other issues might be going on as well. We know we're talking about the United States specifically, and we also know that we're going to touch on a little bit about dangerous working conditions for employees. All of those things play key roles in the future of this project. So a basic guideline is, if you're not going to talk about it again later, it shouldn't be in your context section. In the main grid, the context section is made up of your background and made up of your buildup. Again, a quarter of your thesis statement. The next section, after the context, after you've set that stage, is the content. Now, this is one of the number one mistakes that people make when they are writing their first thesis statement. Because they get so excited about the main event of their storyline, all they want to do is tell us all of the cool things that happened in that moment. While your main event is a very important time period in history, if we don't understand what went on to change, we don't know for sure that your topic, that your main event matters in history. All we know is that it is interesting. Interesting is not necessarily a good History Day project. An interesting story with consequence is almost always a good topic for National History Day. So for that next 25% of your thesis statement, the content is that main event. It serves as the tipping point, the inflection point in your story that sparks the process of change. Oftentimes, the actors in that moment are aware or they are intending to make change, but they can't fully see not just the short-term reactions of individuals and groups, but they also cannot necessarily see the long-term changes that will come long after they've made these big decisions during this main event. So let's take a look at another one of those examples and help us understand what type of information might be in the content section. So in this example, it says, calling public attention to these issues. Remember, these issues related to our context section have a lot to do with working conditions and the emergence of industrial power in the early 1900s. So calling public attention to these issues, journalist Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, which recounted dangerous substances in meats, deplorable working conditions, and corrupt practices of Chicago's beef trust. So we have a key inflection point in this content section. We have a book that's published by Upton Sinclair. We don't know a great deal about the book or why he wrote the book, but we know that he's a journalist. We know he was trying to catch public attention, and we know he was focusing especially on the negative effects of the expansion of industrial meat processing and the effects it was having on their workers. Again, is that interesting? Most definitely. Is this the end of the thesis? Most definitely not. Why? Because we don't know what happens next. We don't know how people react. We don't know what changes happen. And there are many, many stories in history in which something like this happens, nobody pays attention, and the story does not end up being important in history. Again, remember that interesting does not necessarily mean important. So we have this next 25% of our thesis statement. And we finish off our thesis with the other 50%. And that 50% needs to be based in consequence. Consequences can be short-term. They can be reactions by groups like the media. They can be support for people who support a particular decision. They can be reactions from opponents. They can be conversations. It can be news coverage. They can be follow-up books. They can be images. As many different groups that see the significance of this event in the short term will help us understand that your main event gained attention. But you also have to balance that with long-term change. Oftentimes people hear about things that matter in their day-to-day lives that don't necessarily affect them directly. But unless there is long-term change, unless there are long-term adjustments to some of the things that we saw in the background section, the context section, then again, we aren't necessarily certain that there are significant historical changes. So in the consequences section, to summarize, these are the resulting immediate impact and the long-term change, which highlights why the story still matters today. So let's take a look at the example. Now again, this is 50% of your thesis statement. So this is half of your thesis statement. The Jungle, remember, which is that book from the heart of the story, triumphantly inspired legislators to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, which provided much-needed food safety regulations and controlled the beef trust. However, Sinclair's pleas to address workers' conditions tragically continued to remain ignored. So what do we know? In the short term, we know there was a response. It is unclear exactly what that response was. We also do know that it is in the short term, the plight of these workers who were suffering these conditions that they were enduring as an immigrant population were ignored. But in the long term, our food as an American society became safer because of the creation of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act and reining in the power of these beef trusts, which are large groups of businesses together acting in a similar interest. In this case, they were meatpacking owners. And we also saw safety regulations installed. So all of those things tell us why Upton Sinclair's book mattered. Now, the book is the topic. The book is at the heart of the story. But again, interesting does not mean important. So let's look at this whole thesis statement together. We have the context, we have the content, and we have the consequences. And when we put this entire thesis together, increased immigration and industrial advancements in the early 1900s nurtured the United States Industrial Revolution and exacerbated dangerous working conditions. If we have a good thesis statement, we should be able to take what we see in yellow here, and we should be able to compare it to what we see in blue and see how certain things changed. Do we talk about immigration in both sections? Not explicitly in the blue section, but it is related to the worker conditions that were ignored. Do we see a significance of industrial advancements? Most definitely. We see these beef trusts regulated, and we see these restrictions on unfettered industrial advancement in the Pure Food and Drug Act and in the Meat Inspection Act. Early 1900s nurtured the United States Industrial Revolution and exacerbated dangerous working conditions. We definitely come back to those working conditions piece again. So we have a balance in the context compared to the consequences. And as you can just see by looking at this color-coded example, which I'd encourage you to do with your own thesis statement, you can really see that 25, 25, 50 embraced. So again, when you go to write your thesis statement, and you will write many thesis statements for a History Day project, try to use this model. Try to start with the context, try to start with the content, and then move on to the content, and then really focus on what changed in history. What consequence did my main event have in history? How do I know that it is not just interesting, but it is important? By all means, reach out if you have any other questions or you have any ideas about the 3 C's method. This is a tried and true method for me and my students, and I hope it can be for you as well. See you later.